This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who lived in Vienna, Austria. He was born in 1905. He deceased in 1997. And he has developed a revolutionary new approach of what we are all about as human beings and how we can find meaning in life. And he's probably the thinker of the last century that focused most clearly and straightforward and without many compromises on that approach, that what we are about is truly about is to find meaning in our lives. And even though his theory encompasses all levels of our existence, from our body and our emotions to our spiritual dimension, it's pretty easy to understand, to remember, and to apply in your lives. My name is Marion Assenmacher, and I study the science of education in Germany, and that's where I came across Viktor Frankl's theories under well-being theories, how we can be happy and healthy in life. And I love the fact that he bridges our emotional well-being with our spiritual needs, and he's one of the few psychologists who do that. And he actually introduced a whole other dimension besides the emotional dimension we have, the spiritual dimension we have as human beings. And I was fascinated by this, so I wrote my thesis about it, my master's thesis also, and developed a questionnaire to find out how fulfilled people were and certain aspects of their life goals, who or what they were trying to achieve and who they were trying to serve with this. And it was very fascinating that by posing simple questions in the questionnaire, there was very significant correlations to Frankl's theories. And that encouraged me, so I did the whole 3-year program to become a logotherapist in Germany. And logos is Greek and means meaning. That's why they're called logotherapists. This is a term hardly anybody knows. But everybody who studies psychology, psychiatry, neurology, medicine usually is familiar with this term. Or if you read his book, right, and remember the logotherapy, that's true. And so tonight, first I want to tell you a bit about Viktor Frankl's lives, quite a bit, and his experiences as a Holocaust survivor and his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. Then I'll explain the 3 main parts of his theory to you, which are important to remember, to apply it in your life, but they're fairly easy to remember. First, his image of man, then how life is constantly offering us to fulfill a meaning in a unique personal way, and then the ways by which we actually fulfill this meaning by actualizing our personal values. After the break, or before, we'll see how it goes, we'll come to benefits of remembering Viktor Frankl's theories in our life and applying them, and also how the theories can help us to set life goals in a way that we have more of a chance to have success and to feel fulfilled and to experience true happiness. We'll have time for questions and answers, and I'll point out some things we can do if you're interested in taking a workshop end of May or end of June. I'll be offering 4-hour workshops. Okay, so Viktor Frankl's life. He's born in Vienna, Austria in 1905, and he became a professor for neurology and psychiatry in Vienna. He had an MD in medicine and a Ph.D. in philosophy. And later, he was professor for logotherapy at the United States International University in San Diego. He learned from Freud and Adler, who were a little bit older than him, but teaching in Vienna, and he was very interested in how human beings work and what makes them happy. And early on, he had also a special interest in the meaning of life. He tells a story where even as a 5-year-old, it dawns on him that we die one day, and he started to question, well, what is the meaning of life then, if it ends? So, as you probably know, Freud said that what humans, as a motivational theory, what human beings are about is pleasure. Well, Adler said just a tiny bit later, a few years later, no, what they are about is power, because they have this fear to be inferior and that want to make it socially. So what they are about is power and to be superior. And Frankl said, well, that all sounds very interesting to look into the depth of our motivations, but what I think human beings are much more than that. And in addition to this kind of depth psychology, that applies a lot to people who have neurosis, because that's who they were studying. There was much more to human beings. There was the height of human beings. There's their highest aspirations. There was their spirituality. There's their quest for meaning. And so he's also called as the originator of the third Viennese school of psychotherapy. And he is, as I mentioned, very well known in people who do study psychotherapy. And in America, his book Man's Search for Meaning became very well known, which includes in the second part, at least the version from nowadays, the basics of logotherapy in a very simple form. So logotherapy assumes that the will to meaning is the primary motivation of human beings. And he was a strong opponent all his life to reduce people to anything less than their full humanness, which includes our spiritual needs and our quest for meaning. And he said, in a way, every science that reduces people and then forgets that they make this reduction, they dehumanize people in a way. So he said, I'm fighting to rehumanize psychology and psychotherapy. And he did this most through the complete last century. So Viktor Frankl was Jewish, and in 1938 the Germans made Austria part of the Third Reich, which means that they also deported Jews into concentration camps. And he was lucky that he was able to take a position as the chief of neurology at the Rothschild Hospital from 38 to 42, which kept him in society and kept him from being deported into a concentration camp for quite a while. And he was also able to protect his parents this way. And he, like many other Jews, applied for immigration visas, which took quite a while to come along. And when he finally received an immigration visa to the United States, he was questioning if he should actually go and leave his parents behind, his aging parents. He was 37 at that time, so his parents were probably into their 60s. And he was their only protection. And I'd like to read a short story from his autobiography called Recollections, very nice to read, about how the situation looked to him at that time. Come on in, shot water. Okay. I had to wait for years until my quota number came up by which I would be permitted to emigrate to the United States. Finally, shortly before Pearl Harbor, I was asked to come to the American consulate to pick up my visa. Then I hesitated. Should I leave my parents behind? I knew what their fate would be, deportation to a concentration camp. Should I say goodbye and leave them to their fate? The visa applied to me alone. Undecided, I left home, took a walk, and had this thought. Isn't this the kind of situation that requires some hint from heaven? When I returned home, my eyes fell on a little piece of marble lying on the table. What's this? I asked my father. This? Oh, I picked it out of the rubble of the synagogue they have burned down. It has on it part of the 10 Commandments. I can even tell you from which commandment it comes. There was only one commandment that uses the letter that is chiseled here. And that is, I asked eagerly. Then Father gave me this answer. Honor thy father and mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thus I stayed upon the land with my parents and let the visa lapse. It may be that I had made my decision deep within long before, and that the oracle was in reality only an echo from the voice of my conscience. This is to say, it may have been a kind of projective test. Someone else may have seen in the same piece of marble nothing but CaCO3, calcium carbonate. But would that not have been his projective test also, perhaps in his case of existential emptiness? So this is a very impressive story, I would say, of how deeply he was living his responsibleness that he points out in his logotherapy, that life is answering us sometimes very deep questions, and we're not so well advised just to go ahead and do what seems to be the most pleasurable thing. So about 1942, he did end up being deported into a concentration camp, and he had to spend 3 years in 4 different concentration camps. He was 37 years old and points out in his book several times that this was fairly old at the time. Didn't make it any easier to survive because it was a lot of hard work. And he had his first book. I mean, a lot of people assume that there he started thinking about logotherapy and his theories, but he actually had the first draft of a first book sewn in his coat lining. Unfortunately, he lost that because they had to give up all their clothes as soon as they arrived. And later on, that was part of what kept him alive to reconstruct this first book on little scraps of paper he could get a hold of. So then after the liberation from the concentration camps, he dictated the book Man's Search for Meaning. Nowadays it's called Man's Search for Meaning. It had other titles before, From Death Camp to Existentialism, something like this. And it ended up selling over 9 million copies in the United States. And it took him 9 days to dictate it, and he actually intended very strongly to publish it anonymously, just as a testimony of how life was there, and a testimony to how people dealt with it. And some of the main findings he had was that everything can be taken away from people, all their possessions, all their titles, their names, even everything, but there still remains the last freedom to choose how to react to any situation. That nobody could take their freedom how to react, and that people actually reacted pretty differently. A lot were understandably thrown back to survival and just looking out for themselves, but there were also a lot of people who still were able to look out for others and to go around and console people, to give them some bread maybe, and to show up in a supportive way for other people. And another main finding he had is that those people who had a reason to survive, who had still some meaning in their life, were much more likely to survive even these hardest of all conditions. A meaning like the hope to be reunited with loved ones, to be there for your family, or to complete a work. He, for example, envisioned quite frequently his young wife, who was deported with him, and he never saw her again because they were immediately separated, and envisioned her and how he would be talking to her and her lovely being and lovely face. And he even says it didn't really matter at that moment if she was alive or not. It was just the memory of that beloved being. Another thing he envisioned at times was how he would be standing in a well-heated, well-lit room and give a lecture about his theories. So projecting himself into the future. And he felt that he had part of his meaning was certainly to give testimony to what happened and how people reacted and what that says about human nature ultimately. So he did later on in his life give guest lectures at 200 universities in America actually, and also lectured in other continents like Australia, Asia, and Africa. And he regularly visited universities in America, including Harvard, and he was given 28 honorable doctor degrees by different universities all over the world who appreciated his logotherapy. And he wrote 33 books that were translated into 25 languages, while Man's Search for Meaning was the first one published. And there are also training institutes that train people in how to apply his logotherapy in all fields of psychology and psychiatry and psychotherapy in 15 different countries. So next I come to Viktor Frankl's image of man, but I would like to see if there are any questions at this point. No questions? Okay. There's another person coming in. Come on in. Some water. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 important aspects to his theory we have to remember if we want to apply this to our own lives. First is the image of man, who are we? Second is how does the meaning get into life in a way? And third is what are we supposed to do? So his image of man is that we are three-dimensional beings. We have a body and we have a mind, we have an emotional body. With mind, he means everything between what we learned, our emotional reactions, our upbringing, even our intelligence. All these things are located in the mind for him. But we share a body and a mind with every animal, he says. Animals have the same. But as human beings, we have more. In addition to that, we have what he calls the spiritual dimension of human beings, which is the specifically human dimension, because only the humans have that, and that's where we are at home. And what makes us human. And in this dimension, we have freedom of will. We have the freedom, and we constantly exercise this freedom to take a stand to our upbringing, to our automatic reactions, even to our neurosis or psychosis, whatever it is, what comes kind of automatic through our learning process. We first take a stand and decide what we really want to do in the next moment or with our future lives. So this freedom of will comes with being responsible for our actions too, for him. And one thing he really, in his approach to psychotherapy, if people have neurotic problems, he again and again points out everybody's freedom to take a stand towards that and choose, instead of just looking at our own personal well-being, to look at the greater meaning of our lives and what interests us there. So I just talked about he calls it our ability for self-detachment, to detach from ourselves, to take a certain stand and look at ourselves, say, well, I think I'm going to get angry in the next moment, but I don't have to, maybe I don't choose to. And the ability to look at ourselves with humor even, all these are specific human qualities we have and we can utilize, and he utilizes in his therapy. And not just if you're neurotic, but we all have to deal with what's coming up automatically and by habit. But we have a lot of freedom there. And the most important aspect of his image of man is that we are self-transcendent beings. As human beings, we are self-transcendent by our nature, which means that we are oriented towards the world outside of ourselves. With all its meanings and values. And we're not primarily interested in our own well-being and our own pleasure, as Freud said, because we are this on the animal level in a way, and we are more of this if we are very neurotic and captured in this way. But what we ultimately are as human beings, and as healthy human beings, is oriented towards the world outside of ourselves. And the self-transcendence of human beings is very nicely explained in this quote. Being human is being always directed and pointing to something or someone other than one's self, to a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter, a cause to serve or a person to love. Only to the extent that someone is living out this self-transcendence of human existence is he truly human, or does he become his true self. He becomes so not by concerning himself with his self-actualization, but by forgetting himself and giving himself, overlooking himself and focusing outward. And he says human beings are only fully human to the degree that they are self-transcendent. And Frankl says that happiness is always a result of self-transcendent. What we want is not so much to be happy, but to have a reason to be happy. So happiness occurs as a side effect. And he says the same thing about success and fulfillment in general. Because as human beings, we are really oriented towards the world and the values outside of ourselves. And only to the degree that we actually look at those can we have fulfillment or happiness or success. He also has a nice quote about success, which is actually from Man's Search for Meaning, and points out that again and again, I therefore admonish my students in Europe and America, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you are going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen, and the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. I want you to listen to what your conscience commands you to do and go on to carry it out to the best of your knowledge. Then you will live to see that in the long run, I say, success will follow you precisely because you had forgotten to think about it. One nice example in his own life is that he had this tremendous success with the book Man's Search for Meaning, which he intended to not publish under his own name, because he didn't want to distract from the message in it and take any credit for it ultimately. Okay. So how do we find meaning in life? Viktor Frankl says, again, there is a paradigm shift. Often we sit there and say, well, what do I have to expect from life? What is life going to give me? What is life going to offer me? But he says it's exactly the other way around. Life is asking us questions. Life is making us offers. And life is offering a unique opportunity to actualize our values in each situation. And he says that our conscience can help us to work like as a meaning detector, to help us find out what it could be. And he points out and again that this offer that life makes to each and every one of us is really unique and individual, and there is another one in each situation. And if I either find out what it is and actualize it and turn it into something that is real, that becomes reality, or it will be forever lost. And he also points out that it's ultimately more valuable to have a bunch of actualized realities as we get older than just a bunch of possibilities ahead of us. He has a fairly positive view towards aging and even dying, because there is a difference. Possibilities is just possibilities, but realities is something we have made real. So how do we find meaning, live a meaningful life? How do we answer life's questions? And he says that life always offers, there is always one of three options that life is offering us in each moment. Sometimes we're asked to create something, to do something. Sometimes we're asked to experience something that has value. And sometimes we're asked to suffer in an upright way. And it's always about actualizing our values. And with values, he means things that have value in and of itself, kind of in the more original philosophical sense of the word, like friendship, heroism, caring, loving, creating, things like this, not monetary value or anything like this. And you know, we can feel the difference fairly easily if something I'm trying to relate to in my life has a value in and of itself beyond my own personal needs, or if it's just something I feel makes me feel better or more stable or more secure in life. So in a way, these values are universal values, but what is asked of us in each situation is a personal thing, because your life could not ask you to do something that you do not value. So the offer to each one of us is something that we can actually pick up in our individuality, and it has to do with our personal values. So meaning and living meaningful, according to Frankl, is all about living out the self-transcendence and actualizing values, either creative or experiential or attitudinal values. And I will explain a little bit more what he means with those. Another important thing he says is that we cannot make up what the meaning of our lives in this moment is. It is an objective quality, that is an objective offer, and we have to respond to it. We cannot, we are the ones asked, and our conscience helps us to find out what it is. So sometimes life asks us to do something in the form of creative values, which means to create something valuable that has value for others or the world. It can be something very small or something very big. It's basically to do a deed or to create a work or to create art, to do that which is needed. It can be anything from cooking a meal for my children because I choose to have a family and they're hungry, to inventing the cure for cancer. and anything in between. But the common factor is that I create something. I actively make sure that something valuable gets put into this world, something that is needed in this situation, and I value it. The second category, sometimes life does not ask you to do something valuable, something that has value to you, but to experience something that has value and is outside of yourself. And by experiencing that in love or in the enjoyment of nature or art, we transform and enrich ourselves by this experience, by taking this in. And his main example is always to love another person in their uniqueness. Love is probably the highest form of experiential values in his findings. But also sometimes we're asked to enjoy the beauty of nature, a beautiful sunset or something like this, or a beautiful piece of music. Anything where we have this feeling of awe-inspiring, of something that is greater and higher and beautiful to us, or unique or valuable. And sometimes, quite often in life, we're just asked to really focus on that right now and not miss the opportunity and take that in. $7:30. Sometimes Frankl says that life is meaningful and remains meaningful under all conditions, even when we're not able to create values or experience values, but when we're confronted with suffering, with unavoidable suffering. And we all are confronted with this at some time or the other in our lives. And he speaks of things that really cannot be changed, like illness, death, guilt, pain, situations where we cannot change the situation anymore. Then we are asked to change ourselves. That's why he calls them attitudinal values. We're asked to change our attitude towards the situation. And he thinks, and also the people they asked, like in service, and the people on the streets thinks that this is actually the highest form of actualizing values, because we're asked to change ourselves and to transform a suffering we're confronted with into an achievement, a human achievement. And it's the hardest thing to do, and therefore the highest regarded value by a lot of people. But again, this is, according to Frankl, only asked when we're confronted with these things. And what it can look like is first and foremost to not get lost in self-pity, but to try to see how we can make the best out of a situation, maybe even help others through this suffering we're confronted with, or to face our fate with a heroic attitude, and to transform suffering into a human achievement. He has a beautiful example, a simple example. Hello to those who came a little later. I want to share with you. And he says that suffering without meaning can easily lead to devastating consequences, while if we can find a meaning in our suffering, we'll never be devastated. So a simple example. Once an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before and whom he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What should I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the question, what would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you? Oh, he said, for her this would have been terrible, how she would have suffered. Whereupon I replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her this suffering. To be sure, at the price that now you have to survive and mourn her. He said no word, but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. One moment. So if we can see in our suffering how we spared somebody else, even greater suffering is certainly one way that makes it easier to deal with it and find a meaning in it and a value in it. So he points out that it's very important that we don't give in to our own little self needs when we are confronted with suffering, but that we always see where we still have freedom to take a stand towards our condition and show up in a way that allows us to then act self-transcendent again. So while we're dealing with the suffering, we're not self-transcendent, but we are utilizing our ability to detach from ourselves and take a stand towards ourselves, and be able then again to go out and be self-transcendent. He also says that guilt is a real possibility in the sense of not fulfilling a meaning. And the way to deal with it is then to do something we would not have done otherwise, one way to deal with it. He has a simple example that somebody drives down the road and doesn't pay attention and runs over somebody and then feels guilty. And he says, well, you are guilty. You did not do that which was asked in the situation, which is pay attention. And the way to deal with this is to then go out and act on that in a positive way. So he says, because meaning can be found even in suffering, even under the worst conditions, even when we lose capacities or loved ones, life never ceases to be meaningful. Are there any questions at this point? Yes?
I'm curious, did Adler or Freud, I don't know if they've lived to understand logotherapy, but did they have any comments on it?
Yeah, they excommunicated him.
They did?
Yes. I mean, he was a fairly young man. He was 25 when he was part of their organizations and invited to write his first articles in their magazines. And when he started questioning it too strongly to say, well, yeah, but that's reducing people way too much, they excommunicated him. Which is a good thing because he went on and developed his own approach.
They never came around?
No. Some did, some others did. I think Maslow and Rogers, some other therapists did, yes. As they went along in refining their theories about the pyramid of, the needs, Maslow and Rogers to say, whether in the beginning, I think, said pretty strongly, well, first we need our food, and then we even bother about religion or anything. As they got older themselves and observing Frankl, they agree to certain things that this is not necessarily true. Yeah.
And did he treat neurosis and depressive illnesses or anxiety with logotherapy? Did he have a practice?
Yes. He had practices at several times. Even as a young man, he helped young people who were tempted to commit suicide because of bad grades in school. He opened a place to counsel young people in Vienna. And all over his life, he was either in more clinical settings or sometimes in more therapeutic settings. He was treating people, yes. And one very nice anecdote I like, he tells, is he was in charge of releasing people from a suicide ward for a while. So they had tried to commit suicide, and then they were there for a few weeks and said, okay, let me go home now. And he was in charge to make that decision. And he says he developed a simple technique to find out if you should let him go or not. So they sit there and say, I'm all cured and all that. And he says, so you don't want to take your life anymore? And they say, of course, they all want to go home. They say, no, Dr. Frankl, I don't want to. No, you can let me go home. And then he jumps in and says, why not? And then he easily finds out if they will or will not attempt suicide again. Because the person who just says, no, I don't want to do that, don't worry, let me go home, or the person who has those reasons line up, because I realize I have to take care of my children and I can't really do that to my husband. A person who has come up with some answers, what's the meaning in their life right now, is really not so likely to try to commit suicide again. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
So was the common thread in his life's work the search for meaning, the will to meaning of life? Was that the common denominator throughout all his books, throughout his psychology?
Yes.
And that's why Freud kind of disowned him, because that was very different from his psychology.
Correct. Because, it's understandable because the psychoanalysis and Freud's theorists, they were fairly young at this age. They were It's not like they have been around for 50 years. They were pretty young and they were very happy they found this for themselves, which was good findings at the time for the neurotic average Viennese person, that they were deprived in their sex drive and whatever the problem was. So, I mean, and he also acknowledges this. He says Freud and all these people, they will always be the fundament, the foundation of psychotherapy. But besides the foundation, there was more. There was higher things. There was what people really look for when they're more healthy. And so the common thread, was that our main motivation is how to find meaning in life.
It must have been profoundly effective for being at a concentration camp. I mean, meaningfulness of life from
Yes.
that context must have been, incredible head trip to
Right.
access and understand.
Right, yeah.
Experience that.
He was profoundly influenced, but in a positive way. And yeah.
When you read The Search for Meaning, the first, 100 pages?
Mhm.
Because he goes through it and how it plays out in the camp. It's pretty remarkable.
It sounds like a must-read.
It is a great book.
It is. I read it.
It's a great book. And he often quotes things like, if life can lose its meaning under these circumstances, then it doesn't have a meaning to begin with. He says this fairly often, that about a lot of things. It either has a meaning or it doesn't. And just like he says, the fate, belief in God or in a meaning, if that gets wiped away by an experience like this, then it wasn't very strong to begin with. He says, like, faith is like a flame. A small flame gets blown out by the wind while a big fire gets enhanced by it. Something like this, freely quoted.
Self-transcendence is a lifelong process. For some achieve it more earlier, some
Yeah.
later, some never.
Yeah,
It's an evolution.
Self-transcendence sounds like such a big word. It doesn't mean that I transcended myself completely and I'm out of the picture, because there was last century and it wasn't about enlightenment. He never uses the word ego, even though it would be pretty good to use it in this context. It wasn't about transcending and leaving myself behind altogether. It was in each moment finding that place within me where I have the freedom, where I feel I'm my bigger self. It doesn't even mean to physically get out of myself, because if I'm meditating or connecting to the divine, I'm inward, but I'm self-transcending because I'm not dealing with my ego needs and my ego fears and my ego reactions. So, and we fairly easily can feel if we are self-transcendent or not at any given moment when we start paying attention to it, because anytime I feel small and caught up in my needs and my little ego and my fears, I am not. I'm just worried about my well-being. The moment I can say, okay, whatever it is, and that's the good thing, and we'll come to this in a moment with the benefits, that this ability to look outside and be my full potential and connect to the values out there and do what's to be done or experience what's to be experienced. I have this totally independent of my emotional well-being. He worked with psychotic patients a lot of times in his life, and he said, no matter how strong the illness is psychotic in the more narrow sense of the word, and really, there was always the personality, that freedom of the person, is, no matter how much it might be narrowed down even through illness, it's always there. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be worth trying to help the people. How are you going to help anybody if there was no freedom? So it's not about being enlightened and being able to do this at the end of your life. It's kind of more the opposite. Like at any moment, no matter how much the emotional pain might seem, we can get out of this problem by expanding.
So it's clearly about being out of our own ego.
Right. Yes. And he would probably use this word if he would have written his books a little bit later. Yeah. Any more questions right now? No? Yes, no? Okay. Well, it is 10 to 8. Maybe this would be a good time to do a little break. That's okay. But I really would hope you stay around for the benefits. It won't take a whole other hour. So we can look at some benefits and some ways how we can apply this when we make life goals and plans for our lives. And also what the work in the workshop could look like, maybe. Thank you for now. Okay. I wanted to point out that you can see Dr. Frankl speak in TV recordings that were made previously on YouTube. If you go to youtube.com and put in Viktor Frankl, Viktor E. Frankl, E stands for email, then you'll see fairly long TV interviews that were made when he was maybe 60 years of age. And yeah, let's talk about the benefits of applying Viktor Frankl's practice of remembering self-transcendence and seeing what has value to you and what might be asked in the situation to your life. First of all, there are benefits for your emotional well-being, even though we're not supposed to look at this, but they are there. First of all, you have more chance for true happiness, since he says true happiness is a result of living self-transcendence. The moment I'm looking at the beautiful sunset, I'm happy. The moment I look at the love of my life, I'm happy. The moment I focus on creating that which is important to me, I'm happy. So happiness, especially true happiness, is a side effect of living self-transcendence and not looking for it. He says the only way to go for happiness directly is to take drugs or alcohol. But there's no other way to experience happiness except being self-transcendent. And another benefit is that your personal problems have the least possible negative impact on your well-being and on the actualization of your potentialities. Because if I stop focusing on what I think I have to fix on myself, about myself, and just look out what I can do right now, what life is actually offering me, I have the best chance to make the best out of myself and out of my life. And the good news also is that this offer to fulfill a meaning and to actualize a value that life makes to me in every moment is a real offer. It can be done. There is a real chance for success. Actually, pretty much 100% chance for success if I listen in the right way and pick the right thing to do. And so you lead a meaningful life and feel fulfilled. That's certainly a benefit also on the emotional side. Then another benefit is you know how to pull yourself out of your own misery by remembering self-transcendence. Remembering it's not about me. The meaning of my life is not about my own personal well-being. It's about what I do with this world, with that which has value to me in this world. You're more flexible, even confronted with loss or failure, because remembering that the next moment will offer a new meaning, and one that if I find it in the right way, I can actually fulfill and have success with it. Success with creating it or experiencing it or changing myself. And you'll never be desperate, because desperation is suffering without a meaning. Now, here come the benefits for your spiritual well-being and the well-being of others. You live a fully human life, because again, Frankl says that our human life does not happen within our own concern for our own little needs on the emotional level. You serve others in the best possible ways. You make the most out of yourself and every situation. And you actually create that which has value to you in this world. And you experience that which has value to you in the world around you. You don't waste your life doing the wrong thing or being bored, because you learned how to listen to the voice of your conscience. And I think that's a wonderful thing to remember, because I think all of us have these days or afternoons where we just don't know what to do with ourselves. To remember that even if it doesn't look like it on the first glance, there is a unique, meaningful thing that is asked of me and offered to me in this situation. And by the way, we're all in good company, because he says it's like the problem of our times, and with our times he means the whole last century up until this very moment, that we lost our instincts as animals, we lost our traditions that tell us what to do, so we each are challenged to find what has meaning and what is value to us ourselves in each moment. So to have problems finding that meaning and challenges is not a sign of anything bad happening. It's actually a good sign that we are human and that we are free enough to see our humanness and not totally caught up in our pleasure. And another benefit is that you have more success, because if we actualize the meaning in the in the situation offered, we actually do create a reality out of a possibility. Are there any questions about this at this moment?
Just a comment.
Yes?
You could do an hour on each one of those points.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that brings in 1,000 questions, each one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah. We'll certainly have more of a chance to look into this in the workshops I will offer. 4-hour workshops from Saturdays from 9 to 1 at the end of this month and the end of next month, to look into more into how does that actually apply to my life now? What are my values? Where do I have experiences of self-transcendence in the past, in the present, future? It takes a little bit of training to ask ourselves the right questions. But I just can't get over the fact how simple his theory is, ultimately. I mean, he came to it after deep philosophical thinking and looking at other philosophers and asking people, how do healthy individuals work? If you stop somebody on the street, ask him, does your life have any meaning? If yes, what? You know, it's not like he made it up out of thin air. He kind of came from both ways, in a philosophical, very deep way, but also in a very practical way, to see when life works, what is it, what makes it work? What do people find meaningful? So they have a lot of studies they conducted before and after the theories. And there is even a test where you can find out how much fulfilled or desperate you are about your life right now. And several other tests, how strongly you're looking for values and goals and things like this. A test how good your life goals are in terms of leading to a fulfilled life, possibly or not. Different tests out there. So now to the question, how can we apply this when we look at our goals, what we are trying to achieve in life, what we are striving to achieve? And one thing would be important to remind ourselves that to have, besides things we probably still have, like making enough money and having a safe, secure life, that we make sure that we are also striving to achieve values that have value in and of itself, outside of ourselves. Like to ask ourselves sometimes, if we feel creative, what is our contribution? Who do we want to care for, or is there any creative endeavor or intellectual endeavor or artistic, something that we really want to do because we have the feeling we are the ones that should make this contribution. So we always keep in mind that we have values that serve something outside of ourselves, not just ourselves. We have goals that serve values outside of ourselves. Another thing is to be flexible, which you probably all heard in other contexts, but that if we remember that life actually offers us doable steps, things we can actually do towards the fulfillment of our life's mission, then to be flexible and just see what is offered in this situation, not to try to go with the head through the wall and say, no, this is what I want to do now, but to trust that the overall meaning in a longer perspective of our lives also shows up in all these individual situations that offer us to take the next step and see what that is, and not try to force things so much. Because again, he says each moment has a meaning to offer. We can find and fulfill, and also a little bigger aspect of our life, like what should I do professionally, or do I have a creative contribution, or how would I like to be with my family? This also shows up in each and every moment as a specific offer that is doable. And to remember not to worry too much about how to make a living, but always to remember that ultimately the people who figured it all out how to make a living and have a comfortable life are actually some of those who are most prone to existential frustration, because if we just have comfort and nothing is needed from us, doesn't make for fulfilled life. So to always remember to look that we spend enough time with going for the things that have value to us, to create, to experience, to grow into it, and not spend all of our life trying to figure out the logistics of how we make life work on a financial level. Because it turns out that especially those who are don't have to worry about the basics anymore, tend to get frustrated. So it's important to ask ourselves, what am I living for? What inspires me? What interests me? And to go for that if we're looking for meaningful life. And again, it's good to remember that we are well advised to avoid an overemphasis of our emotional well-being, because this is kind of a task without an end. And at any moment we can find something that's worth living for that's outside of ourselves, and that will simply make us forget our emotional discomfort we had. So it's more important, according to Frankl, to look for needs you can fulfill for others than to look to fulfill your own needs. Because again, a lot of times I'll end up doing the same thing, but it really depends on why I do it. If I focus on it's going to make me feel good about myself or so, which is not really a very good motivation according to Frankl, or if I focus on why should I be doing this? What value do I actualize by doing this? Who else is served by this? A lot of times I end up doing the same things but for a different reason. And then I wanted to point out again that I am offering more practical workshops where we're going to sit down with ourselves and in small groups and look at what has value to us, and where do we already have experiences of self-transcendence. It's not like we never had any. And how can we stay on track to have more of those, and to be more easily in the flow of life and pick out the meanings of the situation and actualize our values. Yeah?
It's kind of strange, like I have like this disdain for psychology, but he's so incredibly accessible. And like when you're talking about a lot of his theories, like I'm wondering, was he in touch with like Ralph Waldo Emerson or any of his writings or any other transcendentalists or anything like that? Because it's just like, he strikes me as a yogi, you know, as like a karma yogi. I'm just like, oh, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you have to see the times. He's not in touch with those things because he lived earlier. And he died in 97. And a lot of his theories he developed kind of, he was a pioneer in his own field. And he was in touch with other philosophers a lot, and what they say about existence, existential philosophy, and what we're doing here. Yeah.
Would you categorize him as a psychologist and philosopher, or something else?
You said disdain for psychology. Yes, I mean, he did have a Ph.D. in philosophy, but it was important to him to be acknowledged, and he was, as a psychologist, to be taken seriously in the field psychology traditionally deals with, which means our emotional well-being as human beings, and how it can be disturbed and how it can be created again. So it was important to him that not to get this label of, oh, you're just philosopher, or you're too religious for us or so. I mean, he worked hard to stay away from things that sound too religious, and always said, well, this is not up to the psychiatrist or psychologist to say. This would be up to the rabbi or priest to say. But we acknowledge that there obviously is the inherent need of people to relate to this field. And all of them do it in different ways, even those who say they are not religious at all, and so forth. So he is, I wouldn't say a disdain for psychology, it's just he felt early on that it needs to be broadened, because psychology was narrowing it down too much and then forgetting that they were narrowing it down. And he says every science has to do some kind of projection of the subject they're studying into some plane where they some level where they can see things and explain things, but you have to remember that you projected it. And he says that early psychology, and well, not just early, I mean all the way until they did more of existential psychology, they forget the projection, and then they leave out all the spiritual aspects of humans. So, but he clearly sees himself as a psychologist, psychiatrist, psychotherapist.
It says in
Yeah.
the book that he was doing neurosurgery as well.
That too, yeah.
So he's doing neurosurgery, so he had some neurology training.
Yes, he was a neurologist. Yeah,
And
he's
that's one of the, why he wasn't deported right off the bat in 39 or 40. He didn't get deported until 42, so he was doing, because of his job at the hospital, he was able to hang out longer.
yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Can you speak more about suffering? I mean, like the example you gave of a husband
Yeah.
losing a wife, that there, I could see some justification in that, but I'm wondering, there are times when suffering, like being in a concentration camp, where it's inexplicable.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, in those extreme cases where there's a suffering, let's say loss of a child or something like that,
Mhm.
how does one, from Frankl's perspective, how does one deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, by finding the meaning in this suffering, he has another example of, he met a lady who had the teeth of her 9 children she lost in the Holocaust in a bracelet around her wrist. And he says, how can you live with that reminder? And she says, well, I'm in charge of an orphanage in Israel now. A lot of times it's really of what comes out of that suffering. Besides that, we're asked to not just give into it and be, get lost in our self-pity, but also what comes out of it, what we make out of it, ultimately, or where we then get offers from life to show up for others because of that. And it's really, he says, it's something we have to find in the situation, just to trust that each suffering, each situation for each individual carries that meaning. We have to uncover it and find it, and certainly suffering is one of the hardest aspects of life to find it, but he says it's unconditionally there, it's always there, and it can always be found. And the meaning in that suffering for that person, that is lived by how the person deals with it and transforms themselves. He says we cannot, the meaning of why the suffering came in the first place, we cannot grasp, he says, because he's a fan of these dimensions. And as he said, humans operate on a whole, have one complete dimension in addition to animals. And so does ultimate meaning happen in a dimension that is higher than we can understand with our intellect. So we can have our personal hypothesis why things are happening, but ultimately we will not understand as human beings. But that doesn't mean it's not there. And he likes to have pictures. He has this one beautiful picture that if you have a sheet of paper, I try to without projection, and you have different spots here like dots on the paper, events, for example, maybe painful events, joyful events, whatever, and they don't seem to be connected and don't make any sense. And if you imagine there is another plane going through it that has a curve going up and down and intersecting with the first plane, suddenly they are connected. And he likes to use this example that we as human beings are limited in our perception of ultimate truth. And we have to admit this, but this doesn't mean ultimate truth doesn't exist. I mean, he strongly believes that it exists and that we, in our unconscious understanding, or conscious understanding, relate to that. He wrote a whole book about man's search for ultimate meaning that used to be called The Unconscious God, till it changed the title. And and I think, again, for the reason that he as a psychiatrist wants to not interfere with the religions, in any way, or be accused of being too religious. But he clearly holds true for himself and every human being that they relate to the ultimate truth in some way, and even if it's on an unconscious level.
One of the things they talk about in the book, too, is that after the Holocaust, when he was liberated, instead of immigrating to Israel, he went back home to Vienna. Wow. And he went back to his old position. They gave him his position back at the hospital. And a lot of people, got on his case, because he was into forgiveness. He said, look, not every, they weren't all part of the problem, you know, the people to be the Nazis, etc. You know, not all the Austrians were involved in that, and he stayed. He chose. He said, "No, this is my home. I'm staying." And he talks a lot about that in the book, actually. How that was for him. It's fascinating.
Yeah, he was very much against collective guilt. The idea that there was a collective guilt, that all Germans were bad, and which was pretty amazing after he went through this experience. But he says each and every person is responsible for their own deeds, and there is no such thing as collective guilt. And he always spoke up for this. I remember one story where his wife, he spoke up in front of a lot of Holocaust survivors, Jewish people, and his wife thought they're going to kill him right now because they didn't want to hear it, you know. And then it was years, decades later, but he just felt so strongly that each and every person is responsible for their own actions. And there were good ones, few between the Nazis, and there were bad ones also between the inmates. So.
But he was definitely about compassion and forgiveness.
He was about compassion and forgiveness, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I remember he said something, a quote in there, it's one of the only ones that I actually really remembered. He said something like, just because someone has done wrong to you does not give you permission to do wrong to them, and that just makes so much sense, because he uses some examples about after they were liberated, well, they wanted to just spite everybody, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Some people, they had that resentment inside
Mm-hmm.
them. And, you know, what does that mean? You know, just because this has happened to you, you know, you have the choice to do something different.
Right,
I think
right.
that's really important.
Right. Yeah, it's very nice.
Tell him your Frankl story.
My Frankl story?
When you met him.
Okay. He also has another example of somebody who was actually an active Nazi, and one of the worst guys in his hospital where he worked. And then later he heard a story about him when he became a prisoner of war in Russia or so, and he was consoling and helping. They thought he was the sweetest guy on the planet for his fellow inmates. I mean, that people can actually change, too. He pointed that out. Yes?
Sorry, I didn't hear you talk. I wish I had now.
It's okay.
Would that collective guilt have existed prior to World War II?
Prior? Well, he
In the way the Jewish people have been treated, would there have been some that had felt it was, something higher?
Well, he said he does not. He believes that each action we do, we are responsible for as individuals. But he doesn't believe in collective guilt in the sense of, well, I haven't done it, and I wasn't. But just by being part of the group who did the bad things, I'm guilty too. I mean, if there was a chance to do something different and I didn't take it, then I'm guilty for that. Yeah. There is another, I'm going to be giving another talk too with the same topic you said you wish you had. On the 22nd, May 22nd at the public library. Yeah. So my story, how I almost met Frankl, and then the one how I talked to him. Okay, I almost met Frankl. As I said, after taking his 3-year training, then they have these congresses. And it happens that since Austria, the German-speaking countries, they are all able, they have a lot of training institutes there, and a lot of people who become logotherapists at professional listings, and they have their congresses and all that. So one was in Vienna, and I flew to Vienna and hoping to meet Frankl at one evening for dinner there. And unfortunately, he came back from Japan. He was already 92 years old, and he was flying back from Japan the same night. I didn't even know what that meant at that point because I hadn't done too much intercontinental traveling, but so he wasn't able to come, unfortunately. But it was still great to hang out with all the experts and to see Vienna, which is a beautiful city. And then a little earlier, actually, I was writing my thesis, and I kept having this question. The question is suffering, is dealing with suffering in an upright way, self-transcendence. And I just couldn't answer my question, even though I had written, I read 30 books from him and others. So I called my training institute, and they said, well, the person here is on vacation. Why don't you call Frankl himself? And I thought, what? Do you want the phone number or do you want to look it up? And I realized, well, I guess it's not Michael Jackson or so, it's just a university professor trying to change the world. So I called, and his wife was on the phone, very nice and humble people, even though they must have gotten millions of phone calls in their life. And said, well, he's not in right now. He's Austrian, German. Not in right now. Would you mind calling back in 10 minutes? And so I did, and I got to answer my question, which you probably heard 100 million times. And he said, yeah, that's a very common question, common misunderstanding, but here's how it goes. Dealing with suffering, we are self-detaching, but we're not self-transcendent yet, usually. We're working towards being able to be self-transcendent again. It was a very, very nice conversation, and very interesting then. He was still willing to do these things. I mean, he must have been, that was in 92, 93, so he was almost 95 years old. Still taking questions. He was a very, very fervent advocate of people remembering this spiritual dimension and the free will and the will to meaning. That doesn't get forgotten, partly because the field of traditional, well, not really, but psychology that looks at all the other aspects is pretty wide, and it got more diversified even, and then they had behavioral therapy and theory, so they got more and more, if we do A, then B happens, and here's how we repair it, and his lifelong mission was to kind of counteract that and say, well, I hope your clients know why they want to be healthy, because they will never get healthy if you don't give them a reason to get healthy, which is self-transcendent and not just feeling better about their own childhood. He says that's a common problem in psychotherapy, that people make therapy the meaning of their life.
You're stuck in the drama.
Right, and so it's important that logotherapy does not replace all these therapies. They are important, you know, to get some kind of a handle on what your problems are, but to be an additional piece that comes in fairly early. And in a lot of cases, that's all that people need. I mean, if you don't have a fully blown neurosis, then you might show symptoms because you're so bored with your life and you pay too much attention. We pay too much attention to our little, where we feel a little off. And he calls it a neurosis where the origin is in the spiritual realm, a frustration of the will to meaning in the spiritual realm, or the existential vacuum. And it can show up in the same way as any other neurosis, but it can get healed pretty easily by reminding ourselves and our patients, his patients, of how they can find meaning. There's a lot
So
of...
you're saying neurosis is potentially good?
Yes, well, he distinguishes between psychogenetic, neuroses that are originating in the psychological dimension, and those that are originating in the spiritual dimension. There can be a sign of something good. There can be a sign that you're perfectly healthy, but you're lacking meaning. And then we tend to that which we know, which is ourselves. But yeah. And they found really epidemic numbers, like in studies they did in the 80s, I think. American college students, they found like up to 80% or so were really frustrated in their will to meaning, in their search for meaning. So that's also why he focused so much on that aspect of our existence as the most important one.
Will to power by Nietzsche.
Right.
Will to meaning.
Well, they called it that. I mean, once they found these things like will to pleasure, will to power, they thought, that's it. We figured out what drives human beings. And Frankl said, well, that's what I found out. And I leave it up to your own experience, what you think is right. My personal experience is that reminding ourselves of the self-transcendence is really very good adjustment of our lives at any moment.
Thank you.
Any more burning questions? So I invite you to leave me with your email if you so choose, so I can keep you posted about future talks and also workshops. Yes?
So you want to get the one that you're doing on the 22nd at the library, what time it is and everything?
Yeah.
The talk you said just a second ago?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. The next talk, for those who might have come late today, want to send your friends or so, at the public library, I'm going to give another talk like this on the May 22nd.
What time is that?
From 7:15 to 8:45, something like that. And I'm also going to be giving talks at the Medford Library. And there is going to be a workshop on May 31st from 9 to 1, where we sit down and do more practical evaluation of how we can apply this to our lives. Do little exercises, to look at our values, look at the hierarchy between our values, and these kind of things that are very useful in training ourselves to remember what to look for. And there's going to be one on May 31st and one on June 28th at the Ashland Library. If you get on my email list, you'll always know what's happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.